Hello, class. I hope you had a good weekend. I had a good weekend. I got to fish a little bit, got to walk around our hunting land and look for sheds and whatnot. So not too bad. Um, so last week we talked about cloud formation, and I uploaded an Ed puzzle about naming clouds today. Um, we had a Kahoot on naming clouds. Today we're going to talk about air masses. Um, we're going to continue with our weather unit and weather conversation this week. Cloud formation is a part of the variables of weather. Weather's very complex. This week we're going to focus on air masses because air masses are really important for formation of different weather events. So, what you can expect from me for the next, few weeks while we do this distance learning is more Ed puzzles. So you guys continue to complete the notes. Ed puzzles are always going to be taken for grades. I'm going to have a Google form this week for you to complete some questions on air masses. So make sure you're turning in your work. All work is due on Friday by 11 a.m. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to have a Google Meet just open. I'm going to send an invite to all of you for Wednesday from 10 to 11, so 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. We're going to have a Google Meet if you guys want to hop on, ask questions, or if you just want to say hi. Love to see you guys. So let's get started with our notes for the week. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what is an air mass? What is Mr. Mann talking about? Well, air masses are really large volumes of air that have about the same temperature and same moisture content throughout, meaning it's an area or a volume of air that's as big as states or countries that has about the same temperature and has about the same amount of water vapor throughout the whole thing. Okay, so if you look here, this continental polar air mass up here, throughout that whole air mass would be about the same temperature and about the same moisture content. These air masses move very slowly. Here in the United States, they move from west to east, right? Usually our storms come from the west and they move through to the east. They move very slowly. They don't move very fast. If they form over land, they're considered continental and they're dry. So here's a continental polar air mass. Here's a continental tropical air mass. Both of them would be dry because they formed over the land. If they formed over the water, like an ocean, they're going to be more moist. They're going to have higher water vapor content. So this is a maritime polar, and maritime simply just means like ocean or I don't know if you've heard of a maritime culture, but a maritime culture means that they have their culture is based on fishing and sailing, things that have to do with the ocean. So maritime means over the ocean, and you can assume that if it forms over the water, it's going to have more water vapor and it's going to be more moist. If it forms over a warm region, obviously it's going to be warmer. So tropical air masses are going to be warmer. If it forms over a colder region, it's going to be colder, right? So these air masses forming up in Canada are going to be colder. These are polar air masses. So polar air masses are cold, tropical air masses are warm. We're going to get more in depth into the air masses here. Let's start with polar air masses. So we have polar air masses, and like I was saying, polar air masses are going to be your cold air masses. They form high latitudes, more towards the poles. This could be North Pole or towards the South Pole. They're polar, so more towards the poles. There's two types of polar air masses. You have continental that form over land, and you have maritime. You hear that word again, means over the ocean, right? Maritime forms over oceans. So your continental polar air masses that form over continents or land are going to be dry, right? Continental. And polar just means they're going to be cold. So they're going to be cold and dry. If you have a maritime polar air mass, maritime means it forms over the ocean. It's going to be more moist. and polar is going to be cold. All air masses have these little letters here that describe what kind they are. So a little lowercase c is always going to mean continental. Lowercase c means continental, forms over land. If it has a lowercase m, that means it's maritime. Maritime means it forms over the ocean. Since we're talking about polar air masses are always denoted with a capital P. So here you can see lowercase c, capital P. That's going to mean continental polar. Okay. Here is a lowercase m, meaning maritime, capital P meaning polar. So it's maritime polar. Okay. Continental polar are cold and dry. Maritime polar are cool and moist, right? Polar, they're always going to be cold air masses. The C and the M denote if they're going to be dry or have more water vapor. The other type of air masses we have are tropical air masses. And like the name says, they form near the tropics. So as you see in the picture here, this is like southern United States, Mexico, Central and South America. That would be tropical. So that'd be like Africa or Southeast Asia. These are going to be warm. They form near the tropics. The air in the tropics is warmer than the air near the poles. So we have two types of tropical air masses, just like we have two types of tropical polar air masses. We have continental tropical air masses. Continental tropical air masses are going to be dry, right? They form over land. Any air mass that forms over land is going to be dry, okay? They're also, if they're tropical, they're going to be warm, okay? So a continental tropical air mass is going to be warm, and it's going to be denoted by a lowercase c and a capital T for continental tropical. Our other type of tropical air mass is a maritime tropical air mass. Maritime means that it forms over the ocean. So these air masses are going to have more water content, more water vapor, and they're tropical, so they're going to be warm. So these air masses have lots of water and they're very hot. Okay. Maritime, again, means forms over the ocean. Maritime, think ocean. Okay. What are the big takeaways I want you to get from the notes so far? A lowercase c always means continental, meaning the air mass formed over land and it's dry. A lowercase m means maritime, means that they formed over the ocean and they're more moist, they have more water content. Now, capital P, so if you have a lowercase c and a capital P will mean polar. Polar means that they're cold, they form closer to the poles. If you have a T, that means tropical, and that means that they're warmer, they form near the tropics, okay? So we're going to do a little bit of practice on a map here. So if you look here, a lowercase c, capital T, that means continental tropical air mass. A hot air mass that formed over land. It's going to be hot and dry. Maritime tropical, on the other hand, it's still going to be hot, but it's going to be moist. It's going to have more water vapor. It formed over the ocean. If it's forming over the ocean, it has way more access to water, right? That warmed up water is going to evaporate, and there's going to be much more water vapor in the air. So if you look up here, we have continental polar, lowercase c, capital P. That's how you know it's continental polar. It's going to be cold, right? It's a polar air mass. It forms near the poles, much colder than the tropics. So cold air mass, and it's dry. It formed over the land. The land doesn't have as much water as the ocean. Now, compared to this continental polar, we have maritime polar. Maritime means it forms over the ocean, and polar means it's cold. It's forming near the poles. So your maritime polar is going to have much more water vapor then your continental polar. Okay, maritime over ocean, polar meaning cold. So right away, maritime, you should think moist. If you see a P, you should think it's going to be cold. If you see a T, it's going to be hot. If you see a C, it's going to be dry. Okay, these little letters will tell you all the details about what the air mass is like. So these are the big takeaways I want you guys to get from this week's lesson. Where an air mass forms determines what type of properties it has. If it forms over a continent, it's going to be dry. If it forms over an ocean, it's going to be more moist. If it's forming closer to the poles, or like in higher latitudes, like in Canada or maybe northern Russia, it's going to be much colder than an air mass that's forming near the tropics, which is going to be much warmer. So the second takeaway I want you to get from this is you need to know what the letters mean that describe the air masses. So you're going to have either a lowercase m or a lowercase c. M means maritime. Maritime means over the ocean. If you see a lowercase m, you can just assume that that air mass is going to hold quite a bit of water vapor. If the air mass has a lowercase c, that means it's going to be dry. It formed over land. It didn't have access to all that water when it was forming. Uppercase P means polar. It's going to be cold. Uppercase T means tropical. It's going to be warm or hot. Okay. Your assignment for this week is on Google Classroom. Remember, Edpuzzles are always graded. The Google form is going to be graded. So make sure that you're turning all those things in by Friday at 11. Friday at 11, I'm going to start grading these things. If you have any questions, feel free to hop onto the Google Meet on Wednesday from 10 to 11. And if you have any questions that are simpler than that, you don't want to hop onto Google Meet, you don't want to hop on and say hi to me, you can always just shoot me an email. I'm usually pretty fast at getting back to those. So I hope you have a great rest of your week, and let me know if you have any questions.